Hello and welcome. Good morning to Miamians across the country and around the globe for this second part, that take two, if you will, of a rescheduled program for the session Politics of Vaccination in U.S. History with Dr. Amanda McVety. We'll keep the introduction short since many of you may have seen what we did on Friday. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Scott, Miami's Senior Director of Development for regional programs based remotely here in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. We're so glad that you're joining us today for our 17th year of Winter College. Of course, it is virtual, and again, we apologize for the technical difficulties that we had on Friday, but we are good to go this morning. We had a wonderful weekend of sessions. We hope you had the opportunity to sit in on those. If you did not, those recordings, for the vast majority of them, are available for playback. We would encourage you to check those out, but we have saved the best for last, as it is. It was originally almost the first, and now we've the best for last. And this is an historic day. To my knowledge, this is the first Winter College session that has ever taken place on a Monday. Thanks for joining us for this historic moment. If you have any questions throughout today's session, please go ahead and use the link at the bottom of your screen that you'll see there, and we'll be answering those at the end of the session. It will be 1 hour in length, including those questions. And without further ado, I will turn it over to your instructor for today and my former professor, Dr. Amanda McVety.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for being here. I'm really sorry about Friday. I'm not sure what happened. We wanted to have a chance to redo it and hopefully give you the freedom to also ask some questions that you have as I move through the program. So please do ask questions. I'm going to share my screen to take us back to our PowerPoint. Here we go. All right. So yes. I wasn't supposed to do that. Okay. So back to this question of individual liberty versus public health and the politics of vaccination. And, just this morning, of course, on the news, the big news is Johnson & Johnson, the new COVID Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been approved. And this story is partly about that, right? It's the story about FDA approval of vaccines. It's about the role of the CDC. And it's also about vaccine hesitancy and even anti-vaccination. And what I wanted to do in this PowerPoint is look at the historical origins of these things. And I think one of the ways that history can really help us is understanding our world and why it works the way it works, and why, certain people have power and others don't. And I think it can also teach us empathy and to help us kind of understand where people are coming from who might have a different opinion than us about vaccines in this case, or about medical interventions in general. So I start with this, which is, last year's recommended vaccine schedule. And there it is. It's the role of the CDC, that the CDC puts these out. And for many of you, when you look at the list, if you haven't, had young kids vaccinated lately, you'll see it's much longer than it used to be. And that's an important part of the story too, is just this technology of vaccination and how we've gotten more vaccines over time. So any story about the history of vaccination has to start with smallpox. And it starts with Edward Jenner. And in the 1700s, smallpox was the leading killer within Europe, within the United States. You still had a few outbreaks of plague in that century, but mostly smallpox was what people were talking about and fearing. And they started doing inoculations in the 1720s, where they would take, excuse me, I'm a cold. Where they would take what they called lymph from a smallpox pustule in one person and put it into another person by cutting their arm, often on their shoulder, like where you had your smallpox vaccine, and putting it in there. And the case of smallpox that person who was inoculated would get was almost always mild. But the danger was still that person and their case of smallpox could infect someone else. And that other person would get sort of what you would call more of a normal smallpox case, which had at that point about a 30% mortality rate. So inoculation would benefit the people who were inoculated, but there was a danger for the people around them who weren't inoculated. And it did sometimes cause outbreaks of smallpox if that person didn't stay quarantined, which they often didn't. We have letters from Abigail Adams when she had it done. And there's all these letters she writes about how after she's been inoculated, she's in town, she's at the theater, she's walking around. So she's not staying home at all with it. And though that was kind of normal, even though people weren't supposed to. So what Jenner figures out in 1796 is something people had noted before, that these milkmaids don't tend to get smallpox. And, they look so beautiful, they stayed beautiful and didn't have smallpox scars. So he does some investigating and figures out that what he calls cowpox from the cows the milkmaids would get, that it protected them from getting the smallpox. And he does his tests on this. You can see the famous image here of the young boy who he first, gives the cowpox to, and then he gives, exposes him to smallpox, and he doesn't become sick. And then Jenner tested on other people as well. And when he writes about it, it's a huge success. It's a big revelation within Europe and then also within the United States that he has figured out something amazing. And in this Frisch cartoon, you can see here, there's the milkmaid showing her cowpox scars. And there you have sort of the what you call kind of the inoculator offering this man some vaccine. And variola vaccinia is what they call it, and it's smallpox of the cow is the name of it. Now, as I mentioned on Friday, it's interesting because in 1939, researchers realized that variola vaccinia, which is basically the vaccine of smallpox in the 20th century, isn't cowpox. And so it's more closely related to horsepox than cowpox. So it's kind of unclear what happened and what happened at the microbial level, and that maybe what Jenner had from the beginning was in fact horsepox that went through humans and then to cows, or how it moved around. It's not clear because they shipped the vaccine either through pieces of thread that they would soak inside the lymph, and then they would mail them to people, and they would try to give someone else cowpox from that piece of thread, or they would do it arm to arm. And this was very much, they used orphans for this, for children. So they would, vaccinate one, and then that person, from one pustule could vaccinate like 15 to 20 more people out of that. And so it would just they kept it alive. Of course, they don't know it's a virus. They don't understand what that means. But they keep that supply of the vaccine requires some sort of living creature, either human or a cow, to produce. So they're either passing it through people, even going across the Atlantic, as I mentioned on Friday. They had state orphanages would do this for decades. That this was just sort of standard procedure in the orphanages. And the problem with that was that, of course, every once in a while, they would be spreading other pathogens. As we know that would be a very easy way to spread a variety of other pathogens. And this proved true with syphilis, and it proved true with hepatitis, that there were cases that were well publicized of cases where vaccination had led to other illnesses. And that played a role in the US government's first involvement in vaccination. And George Washington had famously called for inoculation against smallpox troops in the Revolution. And this, in 1813, the US government, this is the federal government, passes this act to encourage vaccination. So looking at the results of what was happening with Jenner's vaccine and saying, the US government should support this at a federal level. And the way it can, because of course, part of the story here is like understanding what is the power of the federal government and how that changes over US history. And at that point, right, it was really pretty limited, sort of the Postal Service, that we can say it's free. You can ship free vaccine through the Postal Service and to sort of encourage it, right? That there'll be an encouragement to try, someone responsible for trying to find, quote unquote, sort of genuine vaccine matter. So it's the federal government's role to kind of get pure, real vaccine, right? And to help that spread through free shipping in the mail. But this is repealed in 1822 after in one case it's actually smallpox that is sent instead of cowpox. And there's an outbreak of smallpox subsequently. Now, this smallpox vaccination it's not a perfect system because, of course, on one hand, you're sometimes transmitting other pathogens. Two, it's not well controlled. Like I hope you can see from this, it's kind of a sense of anyone can get involved. Anybody can sort of start saying they have and sell vaccine, that they have vaccine from a cow, If they can get it growing in their cow or infect their cow, they can do this. So part of the story is it's unstable in some ways, this vaccination process in the 19th century. And it's also, Jenner had said, well, it's going to vaccinate you for life. And that's actually not what happens. It doesn't. It's, you can see what I say there, right? It's very protective for 5 years. And it's protective against death for about 20, for very, very sort of severe illness and death for about 20 years. So this chart from Our World in Data, the best data comes from Sweden, that they had been keeping the best records earlier on. And you can see, I mean, a clear evidence there of the role of state-sponsored vaccination. And that you see a huge downward trend of smallpox in Sweden. But as you can see, when you start involving other European nations, it's not a story of, here's a vaccine and everything, smallpox goes away. That's indeed not what happens in the 19th century. And part of the reason is anti-vaccination sentiment. So the first anti-vaccination movements are about the idea of cowpox, right? That the idea, as you can see in this cartoon, the idea that you're taking something from a cow and putting it into a human. Now, of course, people are drinking cow milk. They eat cow. I mean, they eat beef. So they're consuming beef and cow products in many ways. But this seemed different, right? It seems different that you would take this illness from a cow. But it's also a frustration with a question of like, what is the power of the state and your body? And it's the birth in the 19th century of the public health movement, the very idea of public health, and the first public health bureaus in Britain first, really. They pioneer a lot of this, and then also in other parts of Europe and in the United States. And the men who are in charge of this sanitary movement in Britain get behind vaccination, that they think it's a really beneficial thing and that it is better for the state that the population be vaccinated to keep smallpox down. So you can see here, there's a series of measures passed, laws passed in Great Britain about vaccination, right? So in the 1840s, say there's free vaccinations for the poor and banning inoculation to ban those random outbreaks of smallpox. Then they get a little bit stricter, right? 13 years later, saying it's compulsory for every child before they reach 4 months. And then again, a few years later saying, well, there's penalties for it. It's not just you have to vaccinate your kids, it's you're going to be punished for it financially and potentially even with jail time for not vaccinating your children. And this is what leads to the first real like legitimately organized campaigns against vaccination. And they're campaigns against the compulsion part, as you can tell. And this one's great. This one was actually from Montreal in 1885. And you can see a lot of these images and the propaganda of the movement moves between Canada, Great Britain, and the United States in this period, because these are very connected groups. So here's a good example of some of the main arguments. There's money in it. The sense that doctors have encouraged the state to do this so they can get rich, that they can profit off of vaccination, that you have to pay to get your children vaccinated. If you can afford to vaccinate, you have to pay for it. And also saying, their argument is if you look at the statistics in, whatever they were, they're not perfect, but the statistics they had, they said, look, smallpox has gone down. And it isn't about vaccination. It's a story of sanitation, that, these changes that are also very much part of the public health movement, these changes to, get pure water, to get better air, to clean up the city, all of those things are in fact getting rid of smallpox. Because it's at this time before germ theory, it's the way you understand disease and how people can get infected. So they're saying those kind of movements of cleaning up things is enough to get rid of disease. You don't have to actually, infect our children with something to do that. And there's some success in this movement. One of the sort of signs of success would be that part in the chart where I show you where it went way up. There's an outbreak. There's an outbreak of smallpox across Europe in the 1870s. Very high rates in the Franco-Prussian War. So the French and German war made this clear. But it was also in other places as well. And it was, in fact, because the way that people had stopped vaccinating, it was an understanding of the way that the vaccine wears off, right, over time, over that 20-year period. But this movement against it leads to the creation of conscientious objector. And that term, which we think about with war, was actually created about vaccines, that someone can be a conscientious objector to vaccines and refuse to vaccinate their children or to vaccinate themselves. Now, looking at the United States at the same time. So in the US, it isn't this time the federal government. It is in this period, it's the state governments that make these laws about vaccination. And the way it happens in the United States is what happens till today, that it's laws about schools. And it starts with Massachusetts in 1855 saying, that kids have to be vaccinated against smallpox, because that's it, if they want to go to school. And other states follow on with this and do the same thing. And this image is, you can see this is a later image, and again in Canada, but the argument that these two children remained smallpox, these two kids had been vaccinated because of school laws, and this child had not. Their little brother had not been vaccinated. And this imagery to really put to make the message about the importance of vaccination. And there are many images like this from around the turn of the century. This was the way they were, trying to convince parents of vaccinating their kids. The Anti-Vaccination Society in America comes directly out of the one in Britain, and it's actually the leader of the British Society that comes to the U.S. to help create it. And here is a 1902 document from that society, where you can see again some of the language of anti-vaccination, right? It's about liberty. It's about the pure body Mother Nature gave. You can see some of the language here about why people would be opposed to the vaccines. And this is interesting, the hymn, right? The Anti-Compulsory Vaccination hymn that you can see as you read about it, right? Seizing our newborn infants, blighting their lives with pain, filling their veins with poison. So that language of poison is used very often in this period, about that's what a vaccine is, that it's poison. Now, that same year, here's this article that comes out about vaccine that I think is really interesting. That compulsory vaccination has been abolished in Switzerland and England by this time. So looking at that conscientious objector law and saying, well, in England, you can refuse the vaccine, that here in the United States, so-called free the United States, there's still this compulsory vaccination. And you can see, just the way they talk about it, this language is so interesting, right? Which consists in abrading the epidermis and implanting an indeterminate lot of microbes into the organism of a healthy person. And that, of course, shows you the change of germ theory, that by the time you get to 1902, there is this understanding of germ theory and they understand what's happening, far better than they did, back in the 1870s. It's opposed to the law of hygiene and all the teachings of modern surgical practice, right? That immunity from the contagion of smallpox is to be realized through the attainment of health, not by propagation of disease. So this argument, right, that our focus should be on making individual healthy, and the healthy individual will have the natural resistance to smallpox and won't need a vaccine. Now, one of the reasons people think that, and I talked about this on Friday, one of the reasons people think that in 1902 is that because around 1895, there's a shift in what virus is causing smallpox in the United States. And the variola major, which is the one that would cause about 30% mortality rate, has been replaced by variola minor, which is actually more like a 1% mortality rate. So what it means to have smallpox in 1902 in the United States, not in every case, there are still some major outbreaks, but for the most part, what it means to have smallpox in 1902 is very different, right? It's literally different. It's a different strain of the virus that doesn't make people sick in the same way. So that leads us to this moment in Massachusetts in 1902. And Jacobson, here you see, he's a Swedish immigrant. He had been vaccinated as a child in Sweden. He'd come to the United States. And in this outbreak, there is an outbreak of smallpox all over the US in this period. He refuses to get vaccinated. And he refuses it for his son. He just says, it made me sick. I don't want the vaccine. I don't care about the outbreak. I'm not going to do it. And he's fined $5. And here from the newspaper report, right, you can talk about this, the Board of Health, right, that he pleaded not guilty, he refuses to pay the fine. And it becomes a court case of him saying, I'm not going to pay a fine for this. You don't have the right to fine me for refusing to be vaccinated. And that goes all the way to the Supreme Court with Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905. And the Supreme Court finds several things. So on one hand, yes, that the state can restrict your individual liberty, right? Under the pressure of great dangers to the safety of the general public. So here's the Supreme Court case saying the government has the right to compel you to get a vaccine for the safety of others, right? That public health, the safety of the public as a whole, is more important, overrides your individual right to refuse a vaccine. And also within that, they're basically arguing that vaccines work. They're pointing vaccines are a reasonable means of control. So it's not just that the state can, work over the safety of the public. They're also saying vaccines are, in particular, it's an effective way, that they are an effective tool to stop this public health crisis. So it's an approval of vaccines, period. I mean, that's just smallpox at this point. It's approval of vaccines, and it's approval of the power of the state. This New York Times article talking about that quote, I think, is really interesting about that case. Seeming to say that this has ended the conversation, right? That it's just over. And it's not quite over. And it comes up again in this 1922 Supreme Court case. And in this case, it's about the school measure, and it's in San Antonio, Texas. It's whether the school can, in fact, compel you, or the state government can compel for the school district that you have to be vaccinated to go to school. Because the argument here is there wasn't an active smallpox outbreak at this moment. So if there's no outbreak in the community, can you still compel children, say, that if they want to attend school, they have to be vaccinated? And indeed, the Supreme Court said yes, that you have that right. So it's another sort of victory for vaccination at that moment, saying if you're not in the midst of a public health crisis, you can still require vaccination. And that story jumps ahead a little bit to polio. So you have a story of the creation of the vaccine, resistance to the vaccine, the rise of the federal government's involvement in vaccination that happens with smallpox. And the second part of sort of the modern story of it revolves around polio. And one of you actually emailed me and told me that you were a polio pioneer. And so if you still have your card, I'd love to see it. If you could send me a photo of your card that you would get for being a polio pioneer. So that story begins with in 1954 with Salk's vaccine and this massive testing campaign, right? This largest the largest testing campaign ever at that point, and it was over 1 million. I've seen 1.4, I've seen 1.8. It's a lot of children who are enrolled in this study, and their parents, happily signed them up for this because the fear of polio is so large at this point. And it works. The vaccine works to everyone's great joy. And what happens in the aftermath of that is under Eisenhower, this act, the Poliomyelitis Vaccination Assistance Act of 55. And Eisenhower was a little hesitant about this because, again, the question is the role of the federal government, right, in this. And the argument was that the federal government could provide $30 million for states to help them purchase and distribute the vaccines. And, again, some of you lived through this will remember this massive campaign that is incredibly effective, right? I mean, it just does a marvelous job at getting rid of polio for the most part in the United States. So, a drastic decline in 10 years in the polio cases. And the success of that paves the way to this very important legislation of 62. And this was something that Kennedy advocated for personally, that he wanted. And this was, as you can see down here, right, to assist states and communities to carry out intensive vaccination programs designed to protect their populations, particularly preschool children, against polio, diphtheria, whooping cough, and tetanus. And so right there are two vaccines involved in that, the polio vaccine and the DPT shot. That we have these vaccines, And now we're going to use them. And this, and this was a debate about this. Does the federal government, is this part of its job to produce money, to give money to states to be able to do these campaigns? And it was this idea of, the welfare, that the welfare of the people required it. And it does get passed. And you have this massive campaign, right? 50 million people vaccinated against polio and 7 million children vaccinated with DPT. And there is WellBe, the bee that they created for publicity, WellBe. And you can see a lot of the posters online. If you go looking for WellBe and type them in, you can see images put in these posters. And I love how, of course, it's tied there to the space race. So it's, thinking about the way all these things are tying together in people's minds. And there's a Cold War component, right? There really is a Cold War component. Well, what are the Soviets doing? They're vaccinating. So we should be vaccinating because they're doing it. And another shift of this is, here's the story of how the CDC gets involved. Before this, you did have the American Academy of Pediatrics would make recommendations. But in 1964, the CDC is tasked with this as one of its jobs, that it is going to be the it's now a government, it's a federal, a government bureaucracy that decides and makes recommendations on vaccination. And that's true to this day. And this, if you go to their website, one of their more recent ones, right, is their recommendations of the advisory committee for the flu. So this, they're the ones that put out the every year about every disease for which we have vaccines, about who should be vaccinated for what and at what point. So throughout the 1960s, you also have a story within this about vaccine technology and a massive increase in the vaccines available. And the key person on this was Maurice Hillman. And he worked at Merck. He had worked for the US government some, and then he moved to Merck because he actually wanted to really produce the vaccines themselves. And he's instrumental in all of these vaccines. He perfects the measles vaccine in the 60s, so it gets better by the end of the 60s. But also then creates the mumps, rubella, and MMR vaccines. And it was interesting because when you look at the posters in the 1960s, and I guess this one is from the 70s about rubella, the question is, how do you convince people to vaccinate their kids? Because measles was, basically every human being before 1960 had measles, right? It's so contagious. And, people didn't believe it to be very severe. Now, early in the 20th century, over 6,000 kids in the United States each year would die of measles, but that number had dropped with the introduction of sulfa drugs and then antibiotics, which would combat bacterial infections that would happen after measles. Like measles would open the door to a bacterial infection that would lead to pneumonia. And that was the most likely way that you would die of measles. But it would also cause encephalitis. It could also cause other neurological damage that wasn't able to be solved with antibiotics. So it was still killing people. Kids were still dying of measles. And that this was seen as, well, this is a way to end that, right? Now, we also know today that what measles does too is it messes with your immune system. And measles can, basically it wipes your body of some of your immune memory. So you are more likely to die of another disease in the 2 or 3 years after having had measles than you would have been likely to die of that disease before you had measles. So it's very complicated. The virus is on many levels, it is a troublesome virus. So it makes perfect sense to vaccinate against it once they had that. Mumps, again, people thought, well, it's not a big deal to have mumps, but some people did have complications. They said, why have the risk of complications if you don't have to? And then rubella. So in 1941, an optometrist recognized that he'd seen that there had been an outbreak of German measles recently, and this was in Australia. And he kept having all of these women coming in with babies who were blind. And he, in 41, made the argument that there was a connection between rubella and blindness in children and infants, like mothers who had been sick during pregnancy. And at first people kind of scoffed at it. And then over the 50s into the 60s, they realized that was true. And in the US, in 63 to 64, there was a massive German measles outbreak. And that led to thousands of deaths of babies. There were thousands of miscarriages, thousands of stillbirths. I mean, the estimate is like 30,000 children died potentially in this outbreak. And others didn't die, but had complications of deafness, of blindness, of other complications if their mothers had been pregnant when they had it. So the rubella vaccination campaign isn't about kids. It wasn't dangerous for the most part, about kids kids who had already been born. But it was for the unborn children. So you can see that's how they've made the campaign, because they realized that the fastest way to drive it out of the circulation was just to vaccinate kids. And then you could just slowly drive the virus out of circulation in the United States, which is indeed what happened. And in 71, Hillman created the MMR vaccine to unify them into one shot. And so the politics here you can kind of see in this chart. So this is about measles, right? But looking at the dates, you can see after the improved measles vaccine of the late 60s, this very dramatic drop in measles, right? Reported cases. But again, it's not perfect. There are also, as you can see, some outbreaks, right? The graph doesn't just keep going down. So part of this story of the politics of vaccination since then, it's easiest to see it in measles, because it is so highly contagious. And if there are any weaknesses at all in the herd immunity, measles is going to come through. Now, again, many of you will remember 1976 and the swine flu outbreak, and predicting that there was going to be a massive epidemic. They predicted a pandemic of swine flu in 76. They got the federal government funded this very aggressive immunization campaign. And there's, Ford getting his vaccine. No, it turned out that there wasn't a big pandemic. And there were some cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome where people had reactions to the vaccine. So it was kind of a public image disaster was the outbreak and the vaccine campaign. And so it's one of the things that Carter inherited from Ford. But what's interesting is the Carter administration tries to use it to their advantage. And the Carter administration looks at this chart, right? And that there is this uptick suddenly in measles again in the late 70s. And Carter comes in with this idea of this childhood immunization initiative. And you can see those two goals. So that one, you're going to have 90% of kids vaccinated against 7 diseases by October 1979. So you can see a larger number now, right, than 62. But also to create a permanent system for this. To say, there are about 4 million babies born each year in the United States, and we want to set up a system that's permanent, that they'll always be vaccinated. Kennedy's initiative had been a short term initially, and Johnson had continued it. And it had continued, but here Carter's saying, let's make this a real permanent system that can do more federal government oversight of vaccination. And this does lead to an expansion in vaccination across the United States. And it also leads to changes at the state level. And in 77, there's this really pivotal moment where the Los Angeles school system refuses unvaccinated students to enter the school. There's a measles outbreak, and Los Angeles says there's about 20,000 students that haven't been, I think there was even more than that hadn't been vaccinated in Los Angeles County. And they wouldn't let them in. Just one day they shut the doors and said, if you haven't shown proof of evidence of vaccines, you're not allowed back in school. So, and this made a lot of news. And schools took that as actually, okay, like here's the time we could be more aggressive about this in response. And you can see what then happens at all these states, not all these, but many states start sort of toughening up their vaccination requirements and being more strict about students' ability to get waivers around this. Now, the sort of moment all this is happening too is in 78, they're really confident in 78 that they have in fact tackled smallpox and that this massive immunization campaign on a global scale has worked. They officially announced it in 1980. That they have eradicated smallpox from the earth. The US had stopped smallpox vaccination back in 72 because it just wasn't a public health concern here. But it was this moment of 1980 where there was a lot of confidence then in the power of science, that potentially, look, we could in fact eradicate measles, right? We could in fact eradicate polio, that it's possible to do this. So there was a lot of confidence. But there's also, interestingly at the same time, in the 1980s is really marked by the expansion of the anti-vaccination movement. And that was in many ways tied to the conservatism that put Reagan into power. That those two things are very combined in the 1980s. And it's a question about liberty, right? That the government doesn't have a right to tell me what to do with my children. This backlash, it starts really about the DPT shot, because that some children did have reactions to DPT. And about 1 in every 1,700 had sort of immediate kind of like a convulsion after having the shot. And then 1 in about every 100,000 to 175,000 actually had sort of significant damage that lasted beyond that moment. So there was brain damage in a small number of children. So the first reaction is against that shot in particular. But it spreads, and it's sort of a growing movement against vaccines. But the way it's also tied in the federal government mind is to this question of sort of what rights do the parents have? And this leads under Reagan to this National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Now, what this does is it creates a vaccine tax where you're paying a tax on the vaccine, and that money went into a pool where the government would give money to parents whose children had been injured, that there was money for them. If your child was injured getting a vaccine that the CDC recommends, you can get some money for that. But at the same time, that they did a protection against manufacturers, that you couldn't go to the manufacturers for money and sue them. You would have to use this pool. They also started requiring that people who administer the vaccine must report adverse reactions. So the CDC creates this bureaucracy of any doctor sees any bad response, they have to report it. And that you have to give out informational materials that tell children or tell the parents of children both the benefits of the vaccine and the risks of the vaccine. And as this pamphlet, this is for the actual providers, why you have to do this, right? It's federal law. You have to create these vaccine information statements, and you have to get them out. And I know when I take my children in, you get this sheet of paper, it's usually front and back, that tells you all of the risks of the vaccine and all the information about what's in the vaccine. And that's a requirement. They have to give you that. And that was the idea of making an informed decision about a vaccine for your kids. What happens in the 1980s, and again, we can see it, you start seeing it towards the very end, is that people there's a reduction in the number of people who are vaccinating their children. And it was also a reflection of that they didn't have the schedule quite right with measles, that sometimes they were vaccinating kids too early. And if you vaccinate them too early, the mother's antibodies will interfere with the vaccine production. And the end result is they're saying by the end of the 80s, you should get more than 1 MMR, right? One isn't enough. But that also made people frustrated. Like if your idea of the vaccine isn't working well enough, so it's like you want to have more vaccines. And there was frustration with that. And then what happens, as you can see here, right? So this, in the early 90s, you're seeing an uptick again of measles and an uptick of these vaccine preventable diseases. So that's why the Clinton administration got behind this Vaccines for Children Act of 1993, with the goal of, by the end of the 1990s, that you're going to have very high vaccination levels, that you're going to get, basically what you had in 1980, and the country had slipped from that. So we're going to go, okay, we're going to get even better. We're going to get to, these high levels of coverage for child vaccines. And what happened in the end of this is that under Vaccines for Children, the federal government started buying, I think, 41% of the vaccines to then distribute. And with the Vaccination Assistance Act, paid for another 11%. So that you have, by the end of the 90s, the federal government was paying for about 52% of vaccines and distributing them free. So that's saying that the federal government's job, ostensibly, is to buy the vaccines and give them to free for anyone who can't afford them. And that's made that sort of a permanent part of the government's understanding of what its purpose is. Now, in the midst of that, towards the end, you also have this pivotal year of 1998, which really grew the anti-vaccination movement. And there were a couple of things. The Rotoshield vaccine was a rotavirus vaccine that came out that year. Proved pretty quickly to have some negative side effects. And it was very quickly pulled off the shelves. But of course, those were reported because it was children getting sick. The a journalist published an argument in a book saying that polio vaccination trials back in the 50s had created the HIV/AIDS crisis. And that's been disproved, but it was widely publicized. And then Andrew Wakefield, most notably, publishes this article in the Lancet saying that the MMR vaccine gives children autism, showing a link between the MMR vaccine and child autism rates. And that one has proven very stubborn to get rid of. I mean, the Lancet retracted it in 2010. It's been shown at the time. Other researchers said this is a terrible study. This doesn't meet the standards of science. But it was really well publicized at the time. And he did a whole press conference in front of a hospital the moment it was released. And the media covered it. And at that point, the argument would be that parents' fears of autism were higher than their fears of measles or mumps or rubella. And so they would say, well, if you look at those two things, I can't risk the autism part. And that was the decision of many of the people in the anti-vaccine movement, which really expands in the aftermath. So in the early 2000s, it becomes a larger movement, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, in Canada, of people who are, arguing against vaccination. And that in itself, in turn, leads to some highly media publicized outbreaks of measles. Again, it's always measles is the one that's going to break through. So in California, in New York, and in response, as you can see in this 2020 map, states are tightening once again their vaccine requirements, in the sense that, starting with California, New York, and others have followed suit, saying that you can't have a religious exemption, you can't have a personal belief exemption, you can only have a medical exemption for not getting a vaccine. And they investigate it to make sure it's a legitimate, medical reason that you can't have a vaccine. So there's a pushback happening in the United States. And it'll be interesting, here in 2021 to see what role COVID plays within that. And is that also going to change, these state requirements? So I want to break now and do some questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. McVety. We appreciate it. It's extremely timely, relevant. It's something that's front of mind for everybody here in this country and across the globe right now. And I think I can safely say now, having sat through the presentation twice, that I'm well prepared to be a dinner guest with Dr. Fauci if that opportunity is presented. Thank you for enlightening us in that regard. We do have a slew of questions, a few that we carried over from Friday, and then a handful that have come in today. So I'm going to go ahead and start with one that came in during the live session today. Charles from Wisconsin had asked, do you think Americans are more resistant to government involvement in healthcare than most other countries? And if so, why might that be?
So it's a great question, Charles. And after I was doing this on Friday, I thought, I need to do a little more research on what's happening around the world. And it's interesting. The Lancet did a study, I think in 2019 about this. And you could see where sort of lack of confidence in vaccines was higher in higher income countries. So it was higher in Europe than it was in, say, in most African nations. And so that's interesting. How do we make sense of this? Is it just that those people in higher income countries have less outbreaks of those diseases, right? They don't see children dying of disease in the same way, so they don't feel the need for the vaccines anymore? Or is it more skepticism with corporations and companies? It seems to be a variety of factors. And I want to be hesitant to sort of say what makes someone anti-vaccination, because they come from different parts of the political spectrum. And people come to it from different places, whether it is, my friend's child got sick from a vaccine, and therefore I can't risk that of my kids. Is it, I don't like government, right? I just don't want the government telling me what to do. It's not. So it comes from a variety of places.
Thank you for that. So in that same vein, kind of speaking about, where we get our information in regards to vaccines, we had a question. Why do you think the burden of enforcement was more at the school level back in the 60s and 70s that you had spoken of versus what we're seeing today, where the vast majority of our messaging is coming either from the federal government or from state governments?
Yeah. And again, I think that is the shift towards more federal power and more federal involvement in vaccines. That's really that second half, of my lecture was looking at this. The federal government has been increasingly more and more involved in this. Now, most of these laws, right, most of the laws are about school exemption. So they really are state laws. And it isn't the federal government saying, you have to do this to get into school. That doesn't say that. So it really is state law. But you see more and more CDC messaging about vaccines because of the Vaccine Assistance Act, because of the Childhood Vaccine Assistance Act. These acts under Kennedy, under Carter, under Clinton, those had very real ramifications in the publicity of vaccination and of the federal government paying for vaccines and then giving them into state organizations to distribute. So you really have seen this, an escalation of the federal involvement over time.
So with that transition to seeing the escalation with the involvement of the federal government, it begs the question, politics is going to dictate more so than it would at maybe the local level or the school level. So one of the questions that we had, have seen the topic of vaccinations permeate political discourse on the campaign trail to the extent that we are seeing it today?
No. So you have not seen it this way. I mean, the interesting moment would be actually the swine flu in a negative way. Like there was a lot, Ford got a lot of bad press for that. But for the most part, no, you don't have, what we see right now is, it's different in every way, right? You haven't seen sort of a shutdown like this. I mean, you've never seen it at this level for this long, but there hasn't been a case like this since 1918, right? In terms of a really sort of overwhelming death toll where the federal government's been involved in a way that we've never seen the federal government ever involved like this. Yeah. So it is very different. And the politics of it have been different because of it.
Let's pivot to something that probably ties into that. If there's politics involved, obviously accessibility then becomes one of the questions that we're talking about. We had several questions about accessibility, both domestic and international. So I'll summarize it in the sense of what would you consider to be both the domestic and geopolitical implications of vaccinations being more readily available in developed countries or here domestically in traditionally underserved communities?
So the overall story of global health is marvelous and wonderful in the second half of the 20th century into the 21st. That there is a story here of vaccines being, spread around the globe. And because of the specific efforts of the World Health Organization, because of the efforts of the Gates Foundation, and the effort of individual, governments and health workers in countries all across the world, more kids are vaccinated than ever before. And most children get vaccines, right? The vast majority of children get vaccines. So this is wonderful news. And this has had a very real impact on life expectancy around the world. Now, some of that success has been threatened this year because of COVID, over the past year, because of COVID-19, that messed up vaccine distribution networks all around the globe for other vaccines. And now, we're confronted, I think, with a very real moral dilemma at a global scale of who gets access to COVID-19 vaccines at what point. And you can tell, right now, who's getting access are the wealthier countries, right? And within those countries, as you see in the United States, there's also a question of who's getting access to the vaccines. And, the news is reporting that Americans who don't have access to the internet in their houses, or who don't necessarily they live in neighborhoods where they don't have as many access to doctors and health providers, period. And they're not getting vaccinated at the same rate. Within their age groups, right? They aren't getting vaccinated at the same rate. So that's a real concern. And, the government has tried to figure out what's the best way to distribute the vaccines. Is it, was it state governments and boards of health? Was it CVC and Walgreens? And they've made they've been trying to make those calculations based on how can we get the most people vaccinated the most quickly. But also, the question is the underserved communities, is how do you get them into those communities? And it's a real problem. I mean, it's clearly not working as well as they hoped to solve that problem.
You bring up a great point. I just interestingly read an article, and I think it's probably something that's been so underreported during this, and that is how COVID-19 has affected vaccination efforts for other diseases worldwide, whether that be logistical issues with distribution or whether that be just with kind of public sentiment and good about vaccines and the nature of them. So I'm glad that you brought that up for our viewers out there. Several questions came in that relate to, we'll call them generational differences in terms of an understanding and an appreciation for vaccines. So I think it's best summed up by this question here. Do you think that older Americans tend to have more positive sentiments towards vaccines because of what they lived through with smallpox, polio? On Friday, you had made reference, I love the line, vaccines have been a victim of their own success. Have we seen that with more recent generations and maybe the current public response that we're seeing with COVID-19?
Yeah, so on one hand, it's just that people don't see their neighbors, their brothers, their siblings dying of these diseases, right? The way that they used to in the US. And the first vaccines targeted particularly horrific diseases, right? Smallpox, polio, diphtheria, the DPT, those were diseases that were feared. They were feared in communities. And at the same time, of course, you also had the development of sulfa drugs and antibiotics. So the diseases that had killed people, right, in the first half of the 20th century, are really being defeated by the time you get to the 1950s. And people were, I think, much more happy to get those vaccines at that time. Then what happens is they shifted to the vaccines for diseases that people just accepted as these are the diseases you have, right? Where measles or, from chickenpox, for me, when I was a kid, you didn't get vaccinated for chickenpox, you just got chickenpox. And so there's also a shift in the sense of, I think people have been less eager to vaccinate their kids against those things because they just thought, well, they're not, it's not smallpox and treating it differently. While from a public health perspective, it is, any kid who has leukemia can't be vaccinated. So you need to, and chickenpox could kill that. So you need to vaccinate your kids. And there's a lot more of that like herd immunity sense that it's a social responsibility to vaccinate your kids to protect the kids that can't be vaccinated. And part of that you've seen with COVID-19, right, is looking at younger people, younger Americans, and saying, you might not want to get vaccinated, but you need to, because it's not about you, right? It's your statistical risk of dying is very low, but you are still spreader, you're a spreader. So you need to get vaccinated to protect the people who can't be vaccinated. And I think that message has to keep getting louder and louder, about COVID-19, and hopefully that will reflect on vaccination, period, to encourage people.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Sadly, I think that our generation probably will start to see just a difference in terms of mindset as it relates to vaccination as you look at just the extent of loss that we've seen over the course of the past year. Subset of this question, you touched upon it, but I wanted to dig just a little bit deeper. Are vaccines historically viewed with more skepticism at the onset of a disease, such as what we're seeing now, 18, versus those that have been around, such as, say, polio or smallpox that had been around for an extended period of time? Can you speak to that at all?
That is very interesting. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of something as quick. There were very fast responses in 57, and Hilleman was the key figure here when this second influenza pandemic comes out in 57, that he personally pushes the vaccine manufacturers to produce a new influenza vaccine targeted to that virus. And people did sign up to get it. And so I think there have been moments like that with influenza where people would come and get a new vaccine right away that was just produced. It's not run through all those trials. In 57, they just sort of avoid all those trials altogether. And they're just like, here's the vaccine, use it, take it. And it worked. So I'm trying to think of other cases that do that, where it's just been so fast, and it's rare, right? It just hasn't really happened that way for the most part since the 50s with polio, and then that vaccine coming out, although polio wasn't new, but it had escalated dramatically in the early 50s and late 40s. It's a good question though.
Yeah, we'll have you back a year from now, I think, as we had said. Just the sheer rapidity with which things are changing in this space would probably lead to a whole nother session. Even 2 weeks from now, my goodness, we could probably see a whole history could be taught on the rollout. The last question that we have time for here, and I don't know if this is something you might be able to speak to, but it seemed interesting, so I'll pass it along. Is there precedent for citizens to have multiple vaccination options, such as what we're seeing right now, where perhaps there's some choice that goes into it? And how could that potentially hamper vaccination efforts if what we're seeing right now, where people might look at the initial efficacy of Moderna and Pfizer versus now the J&J shot, how could you see that playing into either improving the ability to vaccinate more or potentially hampering? Choice can sometimes lead to paralysis, as we know.
That's a great question. So it's funny because what comes to my mind with that question is actually vaccinating my dog. Is that I talked with my aunt about this, and that there are certain vaccine like it's the same vaccine but produced by different facilities, and they've said there's one that sort of, like, my aunt would say that was better for the Norwich than another one. So it's interesting. So I have heard that before, versus this year, in the sense of who produced that vaccine, but like, is it a Fort Dodge vaccine or is it not? But I haven't really thought about that myself in terms of asking when my kids are vaccinated as to who produced it. So I don't think that's very common. I think there might be some with people who've had allergic reaction that they might say, well, you can't, they would say you can't get vaccines produced in eggs or something. But yeah, that's interesting. I can't recall a case where like with polio, there were two. There was an oral vaccine and a shot. So there was a Sabine and the Salk shot. And the government did decide to stop using the oral, the drink, in the United States. So there have been moments of that where there were sort of choices about which vaccine to take. But yeah, this case is really different. And, people trying to decide which vaccine I'm going to get. And again, Fauci says, just take the first one you're offered. The far best option is to take the vaccine, whatever you can get. So I'm on the list for whatever. I'm going to take whatever you can give me. So hopefully that's how most Americans will be.
I'm in the same boat with you there. And again, I think it's one of those questions that we could come back a year from now and do a bit of a debrief and kind of see how things have gone over the course of this vaccine rollout here over the next, hopefully a few months here. That's all the time we have for today. We're approaching the top of the hour and the conclusion of this session. So thank you so much, Dr. McVety. We could not be more grateful for you taking time both on Friday and again today. That also brings us to the conclusion of Winter College 2021. It was very different this year, but we're so grateful for everybody who's watching this morning and those who are watching the playback of this recording. Thanks for participating in what's been an historic Winter College. We're very excited to hopefully be with you in person next year, somewhere warm, somewhere sunny, with incredible topics to discuss. Winter College 2021, I'm Mike Scott. Stay healthy, stay safe, love and honor.
Thank you.